Guys, my name is Ankush Gaurav and I welcome you to Contour series. In this tutorial, we can learn how to handle exceptions in a Spring MVC web application. So in general, what happens when your Spring MVC application throws some XYZ exception without having any code to handle that? Let's check it out. When the user requests for this web page, this method in this controller class gets executed and this web page is sent to the user as a response. So if everything goes fine on the server while processing this request, user is gonna get this web page as a response. Now, due to some developer's mistake or some other reason, if while processing the request, this method throws some exception, say null pointer, resource not found, or any other, what's gonna happen? What user is gonna get in that case as a response? As an example, let's consider a case when it's gonna throw null pointer exception for this user's request. So here, now after adding this code snippet in this method, when I would request for this web page, this method is gonna throw null pointer exception. An important point to note is nowhere in this controller class I'm handling null pointer exception. So now when I would request for admission form web page, what's gonna happen? What I would get as a response? Let's check it out. Oops, it has sent this error web page. On this page, it's talking about three important things. On top, it has mentioned HTTP status code as 500, then the brief description of the error which occurred on the server and related stack trace information here. Guys, normally when any exception occurs for which there is no exception handling code written in the controller class, the application by default sends an error web page like this. Now many times developers would like to send a customized error web page instead of this default error web page, which doesn't seem so much user friendly. So question is, what tasks I will need to perform in this application so that I would be able to send a customized error web page when this method would throw null pointer exception while processing the request. Guys, to tackle this requirement, I just need to perform these two simple steps and I will be done. First, I need to include an error web page in the application null pointer exception.jsp page, which I would like to show to the user when get admission form method would throw null pointer. And second, I would need to include a method in the student admission controller.java class which has exception handler annotation on top of it, like this. So let me very quickly make all these changes in the application and show you the concept of working on the browser, and later I would explain these two steps in detail. Alright, so here I have included null pointer exception.jsp page with this content, and here in the controller class, that is in the student admission controller.java, where this method is present, I am here adding a method handle null pointer exception with exception handler annotation on top of it and value as null pointer exception.class passed to it as a parameter. And here it's returning the view name, that is null pointer exception, this JSP web page. So here I'm done with making these two changes which are required. Now let us see this concept working on the browser, and later we would understand in detail what these two changes mean to us. Cool. So this time the application didn't send us the default error web page and instead send this customized error web page, means the content of null pointer exception.jsp web page. Now let's understand what exactly happened here this time. When I requested for this web page, get admission form method through null pointer exception here, and immediately after that Spring MVC framework started looking for a method in the same controller class which has exception handler annotation on top of it and value as null pointer exception dot class. Because we provided such a method in this controller class, so Spring MVC simply transferred the control of execution to this method, and here this method returned null pointer exception view name, means this JSP page. As a result, I got the content of null pointer exception dot JSP web page like this. Guys, here an important point to note is, in this controller class we are handling only null pointer exception. So if this method throws any other exception at runtime while processing the request, like IO exception, arithmetic exception, means the exception for which we have not put any exception handler method, the application is going to send the default error web page to the user as a response, as we saw in case of null pointer exception before putting exception handler method for it in this controller class. So very quickly, let's see it with IO exception. So if this method throws IO exception for which we have not written exception handler method, let's see what happens. Cool. As expected, it threw this HTTP status 500 error web page, means the default error web page. Now to tackle this problem, again we need to follow the same steps as we followed in case of null pointer exception. So here I have added IO exception dot JSP web page with this content which I would want to send to the user in case of IO exception. And here in the controller class, the way we added exception handler method for null pointer exception, I would add a method for IO exception which returns IO exception, means this web page. So now if I request for this same web page, let's see what happens. Cool. As expected, I got the customized error web page for IO exception. So the idea is very clear. Whatever exceptions you think the controller class can throw at runtime while processing the user's requests, you simply go on adding exception handler methods for all those exceptions. Now an important point to note here is, your controller class might throw a lot of exceptions at runtime, and it may not be so convenient for you to write exception handler method for each exception. So to tackle such a problem, what we can do, we can add a generic exception handler method in this controller class such that when this controller class throws some exception for which Spring MVC framework doesn't find related exception handler method, then it would go on searching for generic exception handler method, and if it find it there, it would simply go on executing that. So question is how we can add such method in this controller class. The way to add such method is just this. An exception handler method which has value equal to exception.class is known as generic exception handler method. So here it's returning exception view. So here I would add exception.jsp page, means this one. Let's check it out. So now if this controller class throws some exception for which there is no related exception handler method present, then Spring MVC framework would go on executing this generic exception handler method. So here if this method throws arithmetic exception at runtime and there is no exception handler method for arithmetic exception here, then Spring MVC framework should execute this method. Let's check it out. Cool. The application has sent this customized error web page when it threw arithmetic exception here by executing this generic exception handler method. Alright guys, In the next tutorial, we'll learn how to handle exceptions globally at one place for all controller classes without writing exception handler methods individually in all controller classes. Alright guys, a big thank you for learning Spring MVC with me. If you have any feedback or comments, please provide them below the video or simply write to me on this email ID for all of your queries. Please hit the like button if you really liked it, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel Contour series, and I'm gonna catch you in the next part of this tutorial.